The light in your room hasn't changed, but the air has. You feel it, that sudden heavy stillness that suggests you are no longer the only consciousness in the space. Somewhere, a phone rings with a frequency that shouldn't exist. Somewhere else, a needle moves across a loom made of bone, weaving a shroud with your name on it. These are not just stories, they are invitations. You have opened a door to the Barzakh, and the things waiting on the other side have been hungry for a very, very long time. Don't look behind you. It's already too late to be alone. The silence of Mark's Chicago apartment was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the shroud of a forgotten grave. He sat suspended in the flickering glow of his phone, a modern-day talisman of distraction, until the notification shattered the stillness. One new voicemail. The number on the screen sent a jolt of ice through his veins. It belonged to a line disconnected over a year ago, a relic of a life before the tragedy. Curiosity, a trait often whispered to be the whisper of a shaitan, compelled his thumb to tap the screen. The audio was a cacophony of static, faint, rhythmic crackling that sounded like bone grinding against stone in the deep zulmat of the abyss. Then, a voice emerged from the white noise, shaky and hollow, echoing from the Barzakh, the veil between the living and the dead. Mark, if you're hearing this, don't come back here. The breath died in Mark's lungs. That voice belonged to Ethan, his soul brother, who had been claimed by the fire at the Sunset Inn a year prior. It was a voice that should have been silenced by the earth, yet here it was, vibrating with a terrifying, soulful agony. They're still here, in room 317, watching. The line severed with a sharp digital snap, leaving Mark in a suffocating silence. His mind raced with the logic of the living. Ethan was dead. He had stood before the charred remains of the casket, smelling the lingering scent of smoke and kafur. Yet the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just a memory, it was a summons from a place where the sun never rises. Sleep was a sanctuary denied to him. Mark lay paralyzed in the gloom, the voicemail looping in his mind like a cursed zikr. Each repetition revealed hidden layers within the static, low, guttural vibrations that felt less like electronic interference and more like the rhythmic breathing of a jinn lurking in the corners of the room. Beneath Ethan's desperate warning, he heard it, a wet, rhythmic scratching, the sound of something with too many joints dragging its heavy, scorched form across a floor of ash. The clock struck 3:17 a.m., the hour when the veil is thinnest and the Khabith spirits roam most freely. His phone pulsed with a sickly light. Another message. This time, the audio was a distorted nightmare. Ethan's voice was no longer just shaky. It sounded frail, as if his very essence was being consumed by an unseen flame. "They know I called you," he gasped, the words bubbling through a throat filled with soot. "Please, don't." A thunderous boom shook the recording, followed by a sound that defied nature. A low, wet, inhuman growl that resonated with the ancient hunger of the Ifrit. Then came the command, whispered not into the microphone, but seemingly into the marrow of Mark's bones. "Come back, Mark." Drenched in a cold, oily sweat, Mark stood up. This was no digital prank or cruel deception of the mind. the technical precision of the voice, the impossible knowledge of room 317, the very chamber where Ethan's flesh had turned to carbon, pointed to a terrifying truth. Some doors, once closed by death, do not stay locked. Driven by a compulsion that felt like a tether pulling at his soul, Mark grabbed his keys. He was no longer a man acting on free will. He was a moth drawn to a black flame. The Sunset Inn sat on the jagged edge of the world, a skeletal ruin drowning in a sea of waist-high weeds and rusted iron. Though the power lines had been severed for a year, the neon sign flickered with a rhythmic, sickly pulse, casting a jaundiced light over the cracked pavement. As Mark stepped out of his car, the air hit him, stagnant, sulphurous, and unnaturally cold, as if the very oxygen had been replaced by the breath of the ghoul. The silence was absolute, a heavy sukoon that signaled the world had turned its face away from this cursed place. He pushed through the entrance, the door groaning like a soul in the depths of Jahannam. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of ash. Black scorch marks slithered up the peeling wallpaper like the veins of a titan, reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow. It was a landscape of kharab, where time had ceased to flow. Mark's gaze was drawn to the reception desk, where the guest registry lay open, untouched by the settling dust. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird as he leaned over the counter. There, in the faded ink of a dead man, was the signature, Ethan Cole, room 317. But beneath it, the ink still glistening and wet, as if drawn from a fresh wound, was a second entry, Mark Turner, room 317. "I didn't write that," he whispered, his voice swallowed instantly by the hungry shadows. The hallway ahead stretched into an impossible distance, a dark sirat, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar, like the mouths of hungry spirits waiting to feed. At the very end, bathed in a faint, unnatural glow, stood the door to room 317. Mark moved toward the end of the corridor, his boots crunching on glass and bone-dry soot. Every step, the hallway seemed to elongate, the geometry of the building warping under the influence of an unseen sea. Behind him, the rhythmic creak of hinges announced a terrifying procession. One by one, the doors he had passed began to swing wide. He refused to look back, fearing that to witness the entities emerging from the darkness would shatter his mind completely. He reached room 317. Unlike the charred ruins of the lobby, the door handle was polished and scorching to the touch, vibrating with a heat that felt like a living pulse. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a third voicemail, but he ignored it, his hand turning the knob as if guided by an external force. The door swung open to reveal a spatial anomaly. The room was untouched by the inferno. It was a perfect, stagnant loop of the past, smelling of stale air and cheap cologne. The television hummed, its screen a storm of silver static that seemed to contain shifting, tormented faces. Sitting on the edge of the pristine bed was the figure of Ethan. But this was no longer the friend he remembered. This was a vessel of the Barzakh. His skin was a cartography of cracked, blackened fissures. His eyes were hollow pits of eternal night, and his smile was stretched wide, revealing teeth like jagged shards of obsidian. "Hey, Mark," the entity said. The voice was a terrifying duality, Ethan's familiar tone layered over a deep tectonic resonance that vibrated with the weight of ancient occult power. "You came?" Mark staggered back, his back hitting the wall. "This isn't real. You're a hallucination, a shadow." "Then why did you hear me?" the thing replied, its head tilting at an angle that snapped the vertebrae. On the television, the static cleared, revealing a security feed from the night of the fire. Mark watched in horror as his friend entered the room, only for the door to slam shut with the finality of a tombstone. In the footage, a towering, spindly shadow began to uncoil from the corner, reaching for Ethan just before the first spark ignited the air.
"Something was in here with you," Mark choked out, his eyes darting from the screen to the charred nightmare sitting on the bed. Ethan's smile widened, tearing the blackened skin at the corners of his mouth. "Not was," he whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. The room began to convulse. The walls pulsed with a rhythmic, organic thrumming, as if the building itself had become a living lung for a malakal maut. From the ceiling, the shadows curdled and dripped, manifesting into a creature of pure zulmat. It was a skeletal titan of impossible angles, its limbs elongated like a spider's, its face a featureless expanse of stretched gray membrane dotted with 100 unblinking eyes. It dropped to the floor with a wet, heavy thud that rattled Mark's very soul. The creature did not speak with a tongue. It projected its hunger directly into the center of Mark's consciousness, a telepathic roar that tasted of ash and ancient salt. "You heard the call. Now you become the echo." Mark lunged for the door, but it had vanished, replaced by a seamless wall of pulsing, scorched flesh. The room began to stretch into infinity, a localized Jahannam where the laws of man had no dominion. Ethan stood up, his movements jerky and discordant. "You shouldn't have come back, Mark, but the guest list must be satisfied." In a final act of desperation, Mark looked down at his phone as it buzzed one last time. It was a voicemail from his own number, sent 0 minutes ago. He pressed play, and his own voice, anguished, distorted, and echoing from a future already written in the stars, screamed through the speaker. "If you're hearing this, don't come back here!" The creature's many eyes locked onto him, and the darkness rushed in, cold and absolute. The next morning, the motel stood silent, a tomb of wood and ash. The police found the car, but the man had been erased from the world of light. Inside the lobby, the registry had updated itself once more. 2 names sat in fresh, glistening ink, Ethan Cole and Mark Turner. And beneath them, the ledger remained open, the ink still wet, waiting for the next soul to answer the call of the disconnected line.
NAHID HASAN disappeared just 2 hours after sending me this recording. And when I played it, I realized he wasn't alone. You're now on Nightfall Horrors 002, and there's no turning back.
The second nightmare began not with a sound, but with a scent. The pungent, metallic aroma of dried blood and ancient musk. Elias was a restorer of forbidden texts, a man who spent his nights deciphering the seer of the ancients. In the basement of his London flat, he unboxed a package with no return address. Inside lay a tome bound in what looked like cured human parchment, its surface inscribed with a script that seemed to squirm under the light like a nest of black vipers. This was a lost manuscript of the Kitab al-Azif, a grimoire whispered to be penned by those who had walked the shifting sands of the empty quarter and returned without their shadows. As Elias touched the cover, a low subsonic hum vibrated through his fingertips, a frequency that felt like a needle scratching against the surface of his brain. He felt a sudden, inexplicable presence in the room, a thickening of the air, as if a NAHID had materialized behind him, cold and expectant. He opened the first page. The ink was not black, but a deep, bruised purple that shimmered with an oily sheen. The words were a perversion of the sacred, a series of khatams, occult seals designed to bridge the gap between the terrestrial world and the al-Ghaib, the realm of the unseen. Elias, blinded by academic greed and the thrill of the forbidden, began to whisper the phonetics aloud. Bi ismi al-zulmat. The moment the syllables left his lips, the shadows in the room detached themselves from the walls. They pooled on the floor like spilled ink, swirling into a central vortex. The temperature plummeted, and the light from his desk lamp turned a sickly bruised violet. Elias felt a hand, invisible and freezing, clamp around his throat. It wasn't trying to strangle him, it was trying to pour something down his windpipe, a liquid darkness that tasted of iron and ancient sorrow.
The liquid shadow slid down Elias's throat, thick as mercury and cold as a winter grave. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, yet no air entered his lungs, only the suffocating weight of the Zult. As he lay paralyzed, the walls of his basement began to dissolve, the brick and mortar giving way to a shimmering, heat-distorted vista of a city made of black pillars. He was looking into Aram of the Pillars, the lost city of the Ahd, a place cursed by the heavens and hidden within the shifting sands of the Rub. The whispers started then, not in his ears, but inside the very folds of his gray matter. Thousands of voices, a collective waswas of the damned, chanting in a language that predated the rise of man. They spoke of the Arsh of the fallen, of the kings who had traded their souls for a throne in the void. Elias tried to scream, but his tongue felt like a leaden weight, stained by the ink of the manuscript. He looked at his hands. The bruised purple ink from the pages was now crawling up his veins, turning his skin into a living map of the occult. Where the ink touched, his flesh felt hollow, as if his internal organs were being replaced by the cold, biting wind of the Barzakh. He realized then that he was not merely reading a book, he was being read by it. From the corners of the room, the pooled shadows began to rise, taking the form of tall, hooded figures with no faces, the Hudam of the book. They did not walk, they glided, their robes trailing like smoke over the floor. They surrounded him, their presence radiating a sense of ancient cosmic indifference. One of them leaned down, and though it had no mouth, Elias felt a freezing breath against his ear, smelling of old frankincense and decay. The vessel his
The basement floor beneath Elias shifted, turning into a black, viscous lake that mirrored a sky filled with dead stars. He was no longer in London. He was suspended in the Majma al-Bahrain of the occult, the meeting point between the world of light and the ocean of primordial darkness. The hooded Khuddam began a rhythmic circumambulation around his body, their movements a perversion of the Tawaf, creating a spiritual vacuum that sucked the very heat from his soul. With every rotation, the ink beneath his skin pulsed with a bioluminescent dread. It began to form geometric tillisms, ancient talismans of binding across his chest and forehead. The pain was transcendental, a searing agony that felt as if his nerves were being rewoven with threads of scorched silk. He realized the manuscript was a blueprint, and his body was the construction site for a portal that had been sealed since the time of Prophet Sulaiman. "Release me," Elias finally managed to choke out, the words manifesting as small black moths that fluttered from his mouth and dissolved into ash. The last of the figures halted. It reached into its robe and pulled out a mirror made of polished obsidian. When it held the glass before Elias's face, he did not see his own reflection. Instead, he saw a desert of white sand beneath a black sun. In the center of that wasteland stood a throne of bone, and upon it sat a version of himself, withered, filled with a halo of black fire. This was his Qareen, the dark double of his soul, finally claiming its right to the physical throne of his flesh. The obsidian mirror shattered, but the image remained seared into Elias's consciousness. The Qareen was no longer a distant reflection. It was a hungry predator clawing its way through the thin membrane of his sanity. The ink on his skin began to boil, rising in painful welts that formed the ancient names of the kings of the Jinn. Each name was a heavy chain, anchoring his soul to the desolate sands of the white desert he had glimpsed in the glass. The hooded Khuddam stopped their circling and fell to their knees, their eyeless heads bowed toward him. A terrifying realization dawned on Elias. They were not his captors, but his subjects. He was being hollowed out to serve as a conduit for a monarch of the Sijin, a king whose name had been erased from every holy record to protect the world from his return. His basement apartment began to fold in on itself. The bookshelves burst into flames that burned with a cold, and floorboards wore the shape of a massive, unblinking eye. Elias felt his room, his defiant spark, being squeezed into a tiny, suffocating corner of his mind. Something else was expanding to fill the void. Cold, ancient intelligence. Through human history was nothing more than the fluttering of its wings. Elias pointed. The voice was no longer his. It was Thor's frozen blades scraping against silk.
The transformation reached its terrifying climax. Elias's human frame could no longer contain the sheer volume of the Zulmat. His bones snapped and fused, elongating into the skeletal grace of a dark sovereign, while his eyes liquefied into pools of shimmering purple ink. The basement had entirely vanished, replaced by the silent, eternal architecture of the Sijin. He was now the living Kitab, a manuscript of flesh and blood. The Khuddam rose as one, their voices merging into a singular, bone-chilling proclamation. The gate is open, the king is returned. Elias, or the entity that now wore his skin, raised a hand.
With a single gesture, the boundaries of the flat dissolved into a permanent rift. To any passerby on the London street above, the building would look unchanged, but those with the second sight would see a pillar of black fire piercing the heavens. The man named Elias was gone, his soul cast into the white deserts of the Barzakh to wander for an eternity among the ruins of Aram. On the desk, the original manuscript lay blank. Every word, every curse, and every seal had migrated onto the body of the new host. The ink was dry, the ritual complete. The entity looked into the obsidian shards on the floor and adjusted its new face with a slow, predatory grace. It was time to find more readers. Somewhere in the city, a curious soul would feel the pull of the forbidden. The cycle of the vessel would begin anew.
I almost stopped the video here, because what appears next isn't human. NAHID HASAN kept saying one thing. It's standing behind me. If you're still watching, subscribe to Nightfall 002. Far from the mechanical hum of the city, in a village nestled within the jagged shadows of the mountains, lived an old weaver named Malik. He was the keeper of a craft whispered to be older than the dunes, a technique passed down through a lineage of the Makhlukat, the created ones who lived in the cracks of the world. Malik's loom was not made of wood, but of the bleached ribs of a leviathan, and the thread he used was not silk, but the silvered strands of human memory, harvested from the breath of the dying. The villagers avoided his hut, for it was said that Malik did not weave clothes for the living, but kafans, shrouds for the Barzakh. One moonless night, a traveler arrived, seeking shelter from a storm that tasted of salt and ancient dust. The traveler's eyes were wide with a frantic khauf, a fear that suggested he was being hunted by something faster than the wind. He offered Malik a pouch of coins stamped with symbols that hadn't been used since the fall of Babylon. "Weave me a veil," the traveler begged, his voice trembling like a reed. "A veil to hide me from the Malak al-Mouth. They are coming for my soul, and I am not ready for the scales." Malik looked at the man, his eyes milky with cataracts that saw into the Al-Ghaib. He saw the dark threads of a curse, a lana, entwined around the traveler's heart. The man had stolen a secret from a tomb in the Rub al-Khali, and the guardians of the silent sands were reclaiming their... Malik sat at his loom, the bone frame creaking with a sound like 1,000 teeth chattering in the cold. "I will weave," Malik whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "But once the shroud is finished, there is no unwinding the destiny it creates." As the storm outside turned into a howling sarsar, a cold, violent wind, Malik began his work. He did not reach for a spool of wool. Instead, he reached into the air around the traveler, his gnarled fingers plucking invisible, shimmering filaments from the man's very aura. These were the threads of the traveler's nafs, the vital essence of his desires, his regrets, and his deepest terrors. The traveler screamed, a sound of pure da'if, weakness, as he felt his memories being unspooled. Each thread that Malik fed into the skeletal loom turned a different shade of spectral light, a pale blue for a childhood forgotten, a searing crimson for a betrayal committed in the desert, and a suffocating black for the secret he had stolen from the tomb. The loom began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that sounded like the chanting of
of 1,000 buried priests. "Stop," the traveler pleaded, clutching his chest as his heartbeat grew faint. "You are taking too much. I am disappearing." Malik did not look up. His hands moved with the precision of a sahir, a sorcerer weaving a trap for the stars. "To hide from death," Malik intoned, "one must first become a shadow. To be a shadow, one must surrender the light of the self. I am not stealing your life. I am merely refining it into a shield of Solman." With every pass of the shuttle, the fabric grew. It was a cloth that defied the eyes, in between solid and smoke, decorated with patterns that looked like the shifting installations of a sky that had never seen a sun. The air and the heat carried the scent of cedar leaves and ancient earth, the traditional perfumes of the final washing of the dead. The traveler's reflection in the nearby upper bowl began to fade, his features blurring until he was little more than a smudge of gray in the waking world.
The traveler's physical form was now a translucent husk, his voice a mere echo in the corner of the room. The loom of ribs accelerated, its clacking sound matching the frantic pulse of the storm. Suddenly, the wind ceased its howling, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The door of the hut did not open, yet the room was no longer empty. 3 figures, the Haris, the guardians of the forbidden tomb, materialized from the shadows of the rafters. They were not human, nor were they jinn. They were manifestations of Adab, the divine retribution for the desecration of the sacred. Their bodies were wrapped in bandages of ancient salt, and their faces were obscured by masks of hammered gold that wept a thick black ichor. They stood motionless, their presence radiating a coldness that froze the condensation on the windows into patterns of jagged, occult geometry. "The thief is here," the central Haris spoke, its voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "He carries the seer, the secret that belongs to the silent sands." Malik continued to weave, his fingers moving through the air even as the spectral thread ran thin. "He is under the protection of the shroud," the weaver replied, his voice calm despite the overwhelming aura of the entities. "A work of seer is being completed. Until the final knot is tied, he belongs to the loom, not to the grave." The Haris stepped forward, their golden masks tilting in unison. They did not attack, they waited. They knew that every veil has a price, and that the weaver's craft was a double-edged blade. The traveler, now a shimmering outline of silver light, huddled behind the loom, his eyes fixed on the growing fabric of the coffin. He could see his own sins being woven into the pattern, the lies, the thefts, the blood he had spilled to reach the tomb. The shroud was indeed a shield, but it was being forged from his own damnation. The tension in the hut reached a breaking point, the air vibrating with the friction between Malik's weaving and the crushing weight of the Haris. The traveler was now little more than a whisper of light, a soul stripped of its jasad. Malik reached for the final strand, a thread pulled from the very center of the traveler's heart, glowing with a sickly, pulsating violet hue. This was the seal, the stolen secret of the tomb. As Malik entwined this final thread into the loom, the kafan erupted into a blinding ball of fire. The fabric was no longer just cloth, it had become a localized rift in the burst. The gold-masked guardians roared, a sound like a sandstorm tearing through a canyon, and lunged forward. Their salt-wrapped fingers clawed at the air, trying to seize the traveler before the transition was complete. "The knot is tied," Malik shouted, his voice echoing
echoing with an authority that seemed to come from the earth itself. With a violent snap of the bones, the cloud flew from the loom and draped itself over the traveler's light. On the physical, the heart, their many-eyed the heart for a soul that was no longer there. In its place stood only a shimmering, empty garment, suspended in midair, a veil of zulmat that appeared as a hole in reality. The traveler was hidden. He was no longer part of the world of the living, nor was he welcomed in the world of the dead. He was an eternal prisoner of the weave.
The Haris circled the suspended shroud, their ichor-stained masks twitching in frustration. The traveler was gone, his nafs successfully concealed within the geometry of the cursed weave. Realizing the thief had escaped their immediate grasp, the guardians dissolved into pillars of swirling salt and vanished into the night, their departure leaving behind the scent of a 1,000-year-old tomb. Malik sat back, his hands trembling as he looked at the bone loom. The Leviathan ribs were now charred black, the energy of the ritual having burned the very foundation of his craft. The shroud remained, a ripple of darkness in the center of the hut. It was a masterpiece of Sir, but it was a tomb of its own. Inside that fabric, the traveler existed in a state of ghafla, a permanent, conscious oblivion. He could see the world, but he could never touch it. He could hear the living, but his cries were only the sound of the wind. "You are safe now," Malik whispered to the empty air, "just as you asked." The old weaver stood up and took the shroud, folding the impossible material. With every fold, the traveler's muffled screams of regret echoed faintly, like the rustle of dry parchment. Malik walked to the back of his hut and placed the veil into a chest bound with iron and ayats of protection. The storm outside finally died, leaving the village in a terrifyingly clear silence. Malik knew that one day another desperate soul would find their way to his door, seeking a way to cheat the inevitable, and he would be there, ready to harvest their memories and weave another shadow. For in the world of the occult, the only thing more terrifying than death is the salvation that hides you from it.
This video is over, but the story isn't, because NAHID HASAN was never found. And if your phone turns on by itself tonight, just know you've been chosen. Subscribe to Nightfall Horrors 002, because you're not safe anymore.